Hello everyone, welcome to my talk on child and human trafficking and events. In this talk, I'm going to talk about the relationship between these two things and the way in which events exacerbate some of the problems around human and children trafficking, but also how events serve as a very powerful platform to shed light on some of these problems as well, which is really important for events scholars and students all around the world to understand. So I look forward to giving you some insights in terms of all of this. So for those that don't know me, I'm Dr. Mike Dignan. I'm the head of Department for Events at the University of Surrey. I'm also a reader in events at the University of Surrey as well, which means that I hold a senior research position. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of the #1 academic journal for events and festival in the world, based out of New York in the United States of America. So I've got lots of kind of perspectives on this topic that I look forward to sharing with you all in the next, hopefully about 15 to 20 minutes. And thank you ever so much for Cindy and the rest of the team for inviting me to do this talk. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So in terms of the way I'm going to approach this topic, I've got about 5 or 6 slides, which should, again, take no longer than 15 to 20 minutes. And it's all centered around this big critical issue of the human trafficking of children, women, men of all different ages and backgrounds, and the relationship with events. But before I go into detail about that, I want to make sure that you all are very familiar with what the definition of human trafficking is, the prevalence of it, how big the problem is and how it's becoming even bigger in the previous years, and really who are the victims and how they're the victims really. So hopefully by the end of this slide you'll have a really good understanding of all of that. But I'll start with the definition. So essentially, the United Nations, the UN, defines human trafficking as the recruitment, the transportation, the transfer, the harbouring or receipt of persons by the means of the threat or use of force or other forms of coercion, of abduction, of fraud, of deception, of the abuse of power, or of a position of vulnerability, or of the giving or receiving of payments or benefits to achieve the consent of a person having control over another person for the purpose of exploitation. So that is a very, very complicated definition, and you don't have to take all of that in all at once. It requires you to really go back through this video, really. And just have a little think about what that all means. But really, it's about one person having the consent of another person through coercion. And that is usually linked to some sort of exploitation in various ways. And hopefully all of that will become even more clear in the next slides, really. So that's a definition provided by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime from 2004 when it was first written. So essentially the most prevalent form of exploitation is sexual exploitation, with 59% of all human trafficking victims being trafficked for this very purpose. Other common forms of exploitation include forced labour or services, slavery or practices similar to slavery, servitude, or the removal of organs, according to the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime 2004. The abuse, exploitation and trafficking of vulnerable people and children specifically are thought to be amongst the most widespread crimes in the world. According to the US Department of Health and Human Services, human trafficking is the fastest growing and second largest criminal industry in the world, according to the US Department of Health and Human Services 2004 report. More victims of human trafficking were reported to the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime in 2016 than at any time over the past 13 years, which illustrates how prevalent and problematic and how growing this issue has been. It has been estimated that roughly around 150 billion US dollars of profit is obtained through the use of forced labour by traffickers each year. And the International Labour Organization, the ILO, 2014, claims that 40.3 million people are trapped in modern day slavery around the world, with 24.9 million people being exploited and trafficked, according to the International Labour Organization report from 2017. So that really does, in lots of detail, cover the definition, how big the problem is, and really who are the victims and how they're the victims in this tragic case. So the next part is really how prevalent the challenge is. And I'm going to start with really talking through the fact that really due to the clandestine nature of this crime, and by clandestine I mean very secretive, it's very difficult to understand and analyze human trafficking because it doesn't happen in front of you. It happens behind closed doors in a very secretive way, which means our understanding and data on human trafficking, particularly around major events, is very much limited, according to Finkel and Finkel 2015. However, fairly logically, we can assume and infer that the influx, the bringing in of domestic and international tourists who often really want pleasurable experiences will likely increase the demand for commercial sex. And this is where human trafficking comes in quite significantly. So although data on human trafficking, particularly in major events, is sparse and we don't have a lot of it, data on other illegal activity, we do have a lot of data on that. And that might be anything from drugs to peddling unofficial merchandise at events, and the prevalence of informal economies. It's fairly well recognized. So we know that lots of clandestine activity does happen. Furthermore, major events are increasingly used as a way to bring together a disparate network of international investors and business people to the city. And in the lead up, during and after the live staging periods, there is quite a significant amount of data to illustrate that this visitor market is more likely to consume sex and engage in debauchery, which is naughty behaviour. So essentially the key points there is that, simply put, traffickers trafficking humans, children, women, men of all different ages and backgrounds will likely see the temporary influx of sports fans, event visitors, cultural tourists and investors as a business opportunity to exploit. So that really covers how prevalent the challenge is and its relationship, even more so, with big events. So why is it that event cities are particularly prevalent for trafficking? Well, we talked about some of those reasons in the last slide, but there are various other explanations for why a host city could be an easier target for exploitative activity. So numerous authors have really suggested that the state apparatus, which is the police, the local authorities, government bodies, are likely to be distracted as they engage and deliver what is a fairly big organizational project to change the city, to deliver the events, to have loads of cultural and sports events going on in and around the city, from venues to live sites to fan zones, that actually there's so much going on already that the police might be distracted in many other different ways. The second thing is that there's so many more visitors and so many more problems that are happening in the city that are related to the event, which means again they're going to be much more distracted away from potential things that are going on like trafficking. And remember, the police, the local authorities, the regulatory authority and agencies that are part of the city, the country that host these things, they only have a certain amount of energy and time and resource in order to tackle these particular issues. Then, and this is a key thing, is that imagine in an event city like an Olympic city or a FIFA World Cup city or a big festival city, there are so many other threats that are going on as well. So that might be from political unrest by the local community who are not very happy with organizing the event, right through to big events being a big international terrorist hotspot and threat as well. So you have to really sympathize in many ways with the police and these other authorities, that there are so many other competing demands on them that things like trafficking may not be fully recognized, unlike a regular issue. There's also a question around the fact that events, because they are so intense, they serve as like a honey trap. They attract traffickers in, and therefore they can be used to also identify the problem and tackle it there and then as well. So there's a mixed opinion of to what extent events can be used productively to shed light on these problems and tackle them in the real time. So really, fundamentally, the reason why event cities are targets for trafficking is that critical stakeholders who are typically responsible for securing the well-being and the safety of citizens have really increased resource demands placed on them and the institutions as a result of hosting, and that's a fundamental problem, and we need to work out ways to make sure that that doesn't become a problem. But that's for you, me, academics, policymakers, people in government to consider. So I'll go on to the next slide. And for all of you in the room, and for scholars and students all around the world, we need to understand how events and the study of events are used as a platform for social critique, as a platform for shedding light on these particular problems. And this is particularly key because the people who own these big events, from the International Olympic Committee to the Commonwealth Games Federation to FIFA to UEFA to the Edinburgh Fringe Festival to Glastonbury, all the people and the organisations that own these events, they always emphasise often how staging events is essentially a unique opportunity to educate visitors and people about important social problems that are going on in life. And one of these social problems, as we've illustrated by human trafficking being the second biggest criminal enterprise in the world, is a big thing. And so therefore it's important that we talk about these sort of things. But usually these event organisers really want to make sure that we are aware of these global ideals. So over the past 2 decades, these ideals have been primarily determined by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, and more recently by the United Declaration of Human Rights, which is fostered by the United Nations. And really, major events are bounded by these global ideals as they serve as the reason for their existence. And we don't just run events for the sake of it. We run events because we want them to make society and local economies a better place. So therefore, they can really act as important catalysts of change, especially as organizations and governments struggle to develop global solutions to complex problems, according to Hardy and Maguire 2010. But major events have really come under fire for exacerbating human rights abuses before, during, and after live staging in a host destination. Whether that's the displacement of urban communities, right through to countries like Qatar with a poor human rights record of human trafficking, poor working conditions, etc. And this has, according to a Guardian article in 2021, has led to the deaths of over 2,500 people in the construction of the Khalifa Stadium for the FIFA World Cup going on next year in Qatar. So hopefully you can all really appreciate in the room actually how utilizing events serves as a platform to shed light on these negative impacts, and as well the everyday critical social issues that mean that we need to really ensure that events are socially responsible and they help society in lots of different ways. And these are often part of the really main objectives for hosting events in the first place. So it has a big impact on all those event students and scholars and commentators all around the world as well. So really, if we think about it, at the University of Surrey and events department and the colleagues that we have in the events department that are teaching our Surrey event students, how are we playing our role in helping to tackle human trafficking, children trafficking, and exploitation and trafficking? Well, what we've been doing is partnering up with It's a Penalty, which is a campaign at the Tokyo 2020 Olympics to the Super Bowl, to have posters, videos all across Tokyo, for example, to illustrate how important this is and to illustrate how we need to watch out for the signs of human trafficking when we're visitors to the city, when we're event attendees. So that's what we've been really working on to try and really advance this cause. And hopefully you've seen in this talk, but also in the passion that we all have for this area, our commitment, our social obligation as a university, but also the events department in supporting this, not just talking about it, but actually supporting it. And this is really illustrated by some of these pictures here from Tokyo. So you saw in the last slide that our logo was for the University of Surrey was at the very bottom of that poster, and that poster was transformed into a video that was played all around Tokyo, and it was absolutely fantastic to see it on the underground, to the Shibuya crossing on the top right hand corner, right through to the airports, taxi cabs and that sort of thing, and we're exceptionally proud of doing that. So hopefully you've enjoyed seeing that come to life.
Sports has the
So therefore, thank you all for listening, and I hope that was of interest, and I look forward to the Q&A after this talk when I'll be joining you all for the event. Thank you very much.